Hello. Thank you all for being here today. I think for me actually it's the very first time I've been able to speak in context to a larger group interested in environmental sustainability and sound and using it as a medium of activism. My journey is long into this, so I will sort of tell it like a story that how I've landed up working in the space that I am right now. I have been working between science, art, tech, and community engagement. Initially, and they were all in separate streams, but finally, I think I'm finding a language where all of them can cohesively come into a spectrum where research as well as activism can be together. So I moved to India after living in Austria in a beef organic farm. And I think after I'd lived in Austria, I think there were a lot of things that I realized that how disconnected living in cities I was with nature. And part of my thinking is that when we live in cities and we're inventing things and we are trying to make a better world, if we do not observe nature, our designs are fairly limited. Because one of our roles in society, I think, or to be a part of the environment is to observe actual natural environments and bring in patterns and observations through it. So I'm based in Goa in a village. I live on a paddy field, and I started feeling a little, actually fell sick. And it sort of propelled me into looking at what these allergies were and looking at alternative methodologies of food and medicine, reading into what was causing my biological system to malfunction. And what I started doing was in a 20-minute walking radius around my studio, I started picking up plants that were around the paddy field. I picked up around 80 plants, shortlisted it down to 20, and I started researching on them. I started picking up, and it was all over the internet because I did not have access to libraries, I don't have access to basic infrastructure. And I started looking into papers, I started hacking into papers and on the internet because scientific information is also not freely available. And slowly what I realized is all these weeds had so many medicinal uses. They had so many other uses, and if you just not look at it from a perspective of India, weeds sort of travel across the planet. I forgot to change the slide. So weeds are something like, in Wikipedia at some point there was humans are like weeds traveling across the planet, migrating. And so I thought, why not a symbiotic cycle between the plants that we reject and the way we define and reject them, because we have defined these plants to be weeds. Industrialized agriculture has defined them to be weeds. So what I started doing was collating information from across the planet, how these weeds were being used as food, what were the different uses, medicinal properties, preparations of all sorts, and basically build a book on these 20 weed plants. How I started visualizing, so that's my little bit of a research close-up. I initially wanted to present this as, as making teas and medicines while in exhibition spaces, but one of the problems is with weeds is how to import and export. So how do you get certain weeds across, say, if I have an exhibition in Europe and I have to show it? And it's like the museums would go we don't want to go through the paperwork. So I started building also a representational pieces of what this could be. What I did was what you see in the picture above is this medicinal bottle with plants in them. Each of these 20 weeds that I had selected. And I collaborated with Carrie Ray Seekins, who's been my collaborator for some time in the US, where she had been doing this workshop of converting organic plants and objects into sound. There are two methodologies. One could actually use MRIs. The other methodology was this intuitive methodology where in the sound healing and Sound Healing and Consciousness Institute in San Francisco under David Gibson Smith, Kerry learned intuitive methodologies where, for example, if someone was handed over, say, an apple, say a group of 20 people, these methodologies actually got them to the exact sound frequency for that organic object. So I sent the weeds illegally to Kerry, and she converted each weed into a sound frequency. Now, in this system that I have devised basically is an ecosystem of sound. It has a transducer at the bottom which converts the entire surface of the glass into the sound frequencies. This whole circuit board is actually powered by a solar panel, and there is a humidity sensor. So by the change in humidity of a place, the sound changes. People can actually blow on that sensor also. So the impact of the humidity of the human, because we blow out water, changes the way the sound equates. This was done in order to bring out these invisible relationships that we have, these indirect interconnections, deep networked systems between the body and the plants and the ecosystem that exists. Now, all the information that I collected, I started putting them cohesively together in the form of a book. Sort of gone backwards, there you go. And the idea was that once you have all these, it was to connect the data along with the sonic experience. So before this, I had designed another compositional score out of the data of the sun. And while I was putting my work there, I mean, when I was involved and in the exhibition space, one of the issues that I understood from there was like people had a lot of questions. How did I convert data to sound? What's the data about? And so the more and more I researched, I realized that I had to put them in the format of a book. But how do you connect data, sound, and then distribute it? So I feel like in this project, I still felt like the data and the sonic sculpture were still segregated. I wanted to do augmented reality, where people could actually walk in with their phones and interact with the sound systems and sort of use this as a pedagogical tool. So all of these things I'm processing. I'm living in a landscape which is highly polluted. Bombay is something that I lived in, and there were a lot of conversations that I would land up having with the farmers around me or the fishermen. And this is actually a beach in Bombay, 5 minutes away from where I was living. It's full of construction debris, plastic, sewage. I think you name it and it's there. It's sort of a treasure hunt in its own kind. And along this is a jetty. So I actually was sitting on that jetty while I was in Bombay, and I noticed like a fisherman like unspinning this fish net. It was deeply like mixed up. And while he opened it, I kept watching him, and it went on for a good half an hour, 40 minutes. And I realized that I had to go up and just ask him, what is he on about? So in Hindi, I asked him, I'm like, what are you up to? And so he goes, do you look at all the buildings? And then he pointed to a light right into, because it was twilight, there was a red light deep in the ocean. And I said, yeah. He's like, all that sewage goes directly into the ocean, right there. And what it's doing is, it's creating a whirl. And as I fish, my nets get entangled. And I was like, I would have never known this problem if I hadn't like really spoken about it. And there's so many stories across the landscape embedded and water-related issues. Like in India and a lot of developing countries are bursting at their seams. This method of production, this method of like looking at like, industrial agriculture, pesticides, chemicals thrown haphazardly. How do you educate people of their deep interconnections to the natural environment, that the causality of their death, and which had speeded up, and cancer was more prevalent and lots of different kinds of sickness, was actually interconnected with the landscape? This was the very same ocean I used to swim 20 years ago, and I cannot put my feet into that water. So this led to the birth of two projects. One is osmoscape. So osmoscape echoes of the osmotic landscape. It's actually a graphical notation score which I've constructed out of water data. So I do love quoting this. Water flows from the sky to the mountains, down to the rivers, out to the sea, up into the atmosphere where it's breathed in and merges with the human body. We are an assemblage of water packets, slightly salty like the sea we came from. As Lauren Isley put it, we are a concentration of water, that indescribable and liquid brew which is compounded in varying proportions of salt, sun, and time. And on the day we are born, we are at high tide. And that, very quietly, the sea within us ebbs, and as we go, so do we. So I've been reading a lot on water, and I was like, how do I navigate through all this information and data? I feel like we are a generation of overloaded data. Trying to figure out like what is fake, what is real, how do you work through, what is the premise through what I derive, how do you build network patterns of inter-association between small datas, and how do you actually get people to think about it apart from it being numbers? How do you transcend information into a more intuitive understanding? I mean, these are the questions that I started asking. How do you pattern build, connect things? And so slowly, the birth of Osmoscape took place. I collected data from NGOs, governments, thanks to, sci-fi, I sort of hacked into different scientific papers. I got like private data. It's been a mix of things that I collated for this. Interesting fact, Nestle has the largest water database on underground water, sweet water available. Okay. So what did I do with the data? I found, like for example, I found this data set, which is on the amount of rainfall that has happened in the last 100 years. Took it into code, processing, and converted associations. By the way, I must give disclaimers. I'm not the genius on board here. I work with a group of people. I truly believe like environmental stewardship is when a large group of people come together towards a single vision of achieving something. So I worked with a creative coder, and basically he helped me code and build this system. This is different rainfall along with drought. So I'm just showing you the process. So what lands up happening is, now I was thinking when I got into this project that this was going to be large, big data, and it'll be super easy. Program a few of them, and I'll have few associations. But the problem is, data is actually not being regularly collected. There are lots of gaps. They are very small. You can't really draw conclusions out of it. So instead of the initial proposal of 3 or 4 large data sets, I land up with 50 data sets. And I've built the landscape of 50 data sets. So this score, actually, what lands up happening is these are all the different premises of the score. This is visualized as a sculpture, so it can be shown in museum spaces. This is visualized as a book. This is visualized as a large signage that can be pasted anywhere on the walls, on the glass facades of buildings. It comes with a QR code, and what connects all of them is a web app. So what I wanted to build was to truly liberate the idea from a contained spectrum, but have different access points. And people who never visit to museums have access on the street. They have different spaces, specifically in India, which doesn't have that many museums. So, I mean, this was the user experience that I was hoping for. So these are some of my collaborators. There are researchers. I mean, I sometimes land up building teams of around 20 people, varying from different skill sets. And it's not like I haven't faced problems. Sometimes to simplify data, what lands up happening is that you don't have many people riding between the spectrum of art, science. So I was collaborating as a co-writer for the book, and she struggled with the data. So I started then working with individuals to translate from different architects, ocean research centers, biotechnology, recently graduated students, to convert the data into something accessible and meaningful so that we could continue co-writing this book and make something which is true to the idea. So this is Osmoscape. So the idea is, the book has 7 chapters. It's the journey of water from space to the ocean. These are the 7 chapters. This is the effect of carbon and water. Each one has a different baseline track. This has got to do with industrialized agriculture and its impact, because 70% of your water lands up going into agriculture. Also, it's a major pollutant where you have surface runoffs. What I've done is, along the path of the water, I've attached different case studies. These are all different stories of different kinds of pollution, different kinds of issues in society that are existing correlated in correlationship to water. So now, when you roll over it, the viewer becomes the music maker or the sound maker. Now, if someone wants to read more on this information, I have all the data. We describe how the sound has been converted and how it's getting triggered. There is a data description. This is the sound signature of water. Basically, how do we seek for life in space? And that's basically looking at the refraction of water when the planet passes in front of its star. It bends light in a very particular way, and that is the water signature. But then, how does one understand all of this? So what I've done is, basically, along with the data, the sound distorts. And so the idea is that hopefully one day, now this piece is only 40% made. There are a lot of glitches in it. So there's a big disclaimer there. I'm hoping the next step, when I'm able to get more funds and I'm able to raise, that the viewer can be a co-creator. They can select the data sets by using this button and build compositions along with the already existing data sets that are in this spectrum of 50. And hopefully then I could create a loop where people can share it on social media, and it becomes a space where data and sound can be co-created and people can read. Now the idea is that when it goes on the street, how can people access it and understand it? I am planning to basically make it accessible on mobile phone, but till it's not fully developed, it cannot be in India. Maximum amount of users of technology is based off mobile phones. Even in Dharavi, when I've done a project to bring about change and to do the data recording, which was being done mainly by women, it was being done by mobile phones. So there are QR codes in the composition that people can go wherever it's stuck. There's a little grunge there, and then people can access it through their mobile phones. Also, another issue would be language. So I'm hoping, as more and more funding comes and I can approach, when it reaches a stage, to different NGOs and organizations, I'm hoping that we can change it to multiple languages as it sort of evolves in its desire to extend and sort of be accessible to more people. So I've tried to think of as many issues as possible, but this is something, I think one of the main issues has been to develop this project and keep it consistent when you're trying to manage 20 people and working on a very low budget. Wait, I have to close the app so the sound reduces. You know, one of the things I forgot while I was yapping was, did I sort of play the video for the previous project? The sound? No, I did not, right? Should I go back or go to the next project? Maybe I'll play that later. So, right now I'm stuck in a lot of work in progress. So this is another data-driven piece that I've been working on. It's called From Paradigm to Paradigm into the Biomic Time. The score actually is built of misinformed and manipulated statements made by people of influence or organizations of influence, and I've collected them from around the different parts of the planet. What I did was, so just to show you some of the statements that I have collected. Botanically, the coconut tree is not even a tree because it does not have branches. Tropical rainforest doesn't catch fire. So this story that the Amazon is burning is a lie, and we have to fight it with real numbers, and that's Bolsaro. So, I mean, it's like also, how do you retaliate against such statements which are being thrown around and misinforming people? And people, when you have a large group of uneducated people, they take it at face value. So what I started doing was inputting all these statements into a code and generating haikus out of it. So for example, I'm going to show you some of my short selected ones. So for example, and this is what we will be using in the protest tomorrow. So for example, fact that less than 1% of the trash in the ocean is from United States, an inconvenient truth that the climate change alarmists have left out. So from the generated code, what came out was from the to that, to the United Climate Truth, to the inconvenient. So what I did was I edited out what I thought was grammatically incorrect, and then obviously after a point, creativity ebbed, and they got like more cheekier. So what became of it was from the United Climate Truth to the inconvenient. And so I started building these scores in these 3 constellations. Behind what you find is Braille, so making the unseen seen. And whatever was edited was actually punched, and then I had made an automated punch piano which mimics a printing press, which I will just show. But I'll send. Greenland is melting a little bit at the edges, getting thicker in the center, but overall the ice is perfectly rock solid. Very little change. So this is into the ice, melting little, but again. Criminalizing sex and reproduction is saying that all heterosexual intercourse is rape, and every baby is a risk to the planet as it will increase carbon emissions. This became carbon sexual in heat again. The science is not settled, and the science is actually going through the other way. We may in fact be going into a cooling period. What it became? No science along this, but we cool. Farmers have always practiced stubble burning. It's a natural system. Repeated criticism of it is unfortunate. Government should hold yagya to please Lord Indra, as done traditionally. The criticism always stub with no stem to system. So this is just a few of the things. Basically what starts happening then is I take all, so then I was able to gather around 91 statements from different parts of the world. I made a score out of it, which sort of looks like that image. Let me just put it in slideshow. I manually printed it out. Now the thing is these statements also become a book. So all of them, because I've been started archiving, I've sort of started getting into documenting and giving context and actually stating why scientifically these statements are incorrect. Once it was in a score and in a book format, I had to divide them into chapters. How do you give logic to it? How do you organize the data? And so it went into the basic systems of earth, water, fire, void becoming policy. And so this became a sort of a 40-feet printing press that goes into a punch piano, which I have constructed. So I'm just going to, oopsie daisy. I'm going to just play it quickly. Sorry for the abruptness. This piece is still a work in progress. We are creating a vocal performance piece at the Diadi Gallery. Hopefully, it'll be more in access by March. There's another project. Most of them have been a little work in progress because I've been working on them for almost 4 to 5 years, each one of them, because it takes a long time to collect the data and actually organize it into something cohesive and accessible and simplified. The last project that I'm going to talk about is basically related to the water issues. It's one Osmoscape, which was based on problems. The second one is based on how plants can be used as a cleaning system. I started there is a system called phytoremediation. Phytoremediation is basically when you are able to put certain kinds of plants in soil, in certain air, and certain water, they are able to absorb and break down pollutants and toxins and make them less harmless. So either they bioaccumulate or they basically use the bacterial ecology to actually break it down into a less toxic level. So I'm just going to show you a video where I do all the talking and explain the project because it's still a work in progress. It'll be much more easier to actually understand if I can find it. So over the past few years, as my project has become heavily research-based, I've become interested in the data, its representation, and how one actually communicates that to the larger audience. Now, as the internet continues to blur the boundaries between communities, the world as we see has become increasingly data-driven. Information overload, lack of meaning, complexity, and fake news has made people feel anxious and powerless. So I find myself asking questions. How do I make this data experience, which I present within my work, more intuitive and creative for the viewer, so that they can build new neural networks and draw insights from the data presented? The work being proposed for the ASU Leonardo Fellowship is a work in progress and is inspired by phytoremediation. This actually refers to the technologies that use living plants and their associated microorganisms to clean up soil, air, and water by removing or rendering toxic contaminants harmless. The plants chosen for this project can specifically grow in water bodies and wetlands in the tropics to the temperate zones where most of the low income economies are found. This is the criteria for the research. Another reason why I've invested my energy into consolidating this research is because it is an extremely cost effective plant based approach. And I hope that future ecologies in low income economies can use this assimilated research to adopt these plants in their local spaces and discharge clean water before it actually enters into the water system. Now, how I imagine this to be is that when someone enters into the room where this work is installed, the sound that you're currently hearing is the baseline sound, and it will immerse the room where this interactive installation will be placed. A biosphere in a glass tube containing 40 such plants will be built with copper slides, which mimic how PCB boards are printed. Each plant is represented by one main pollutant, though in actuality every plant can remediate multiple metals and chemicals. The pollutants are divided into 4 categories: agricultural, industrial, heavy metal, sewage. So the main question is, how does the viewer engage and learn? A table placed in the same room will let the viewer pick up the water pollutants in the test tube and take it to a barcode reader as if in a supermarket. Each barcode is connected to the sound frequency which represents the pollutants. Activating the frequency via the barcode results in layering of these frequencies on top of the baseline track which represents water, thus symbolically representing how commodities get easily intermingled with water and enter into ecological and bodily systems. So, how is the sound created? The enthalpy of each chemical bond has been calculated and converted into an audible frequency range. What exactly is enthalpy? It is when atoms combine to form a compound or the breakdown of compounds, resulting in heat that is released or absorbed in a chemical reaction. This change in energy was mathematically converted to an audible frequency range. Simultaneously, when the viewer activates the barcode for sound, the plant information in the form of a digital book also appears on the LCD which is placed on the table, where the viewer would be able to interact and read. There is also an analog book placed alongside. This book contains the information like what environmental conditions the plant can grow under, which toxins a particular plant can remediate, what are the food, nutritional benefits, and additional uses of each plant apart from its phytoremediation capabilities. The concept of phytoremediation has only appeared in literature in the last 20 years. As many of the metals that can be hyperaccumulated are also essential nutrients for humans and other biological entities, therefore, another symbiotic relationship can be built. So, if it just did go over the head a bit, it's still a work in progress and it is quite nerdy to a certain extent. There's a lot of data accumulation. But the idea is that how do you make a sonic environment and how do you interact with it? And at the end of it, basically, one is, okay, I started using these barcode readers where I could mimic a supermarket because these are the objects that are actually putting all these pollutants back into the water systems. But then I realized after making this concept that the data, that the interaction is only limited to one person. So now I'm planning to expand this interaction and see how I can use QR codes and multiple mobile phones to actually engage and let people superimpose on that baseline soundtrack which represents water, all these different frequencies which the pollutants represent. And invariably, at some point, there'll be people with different kinds of curiosities. Some people will enter maybe just on a sonic level. But I think as more and more people get curious and they ask fundamentally more questions, it will at some point seep into the data. So I'm using all these different prototype testing systems to actually see how we could activate a more sonic and environmentally pedagogical, creative, and intuitive environment for the future. And if you need time to process, you can ask me later too, because go for it.
Hello. So it's only accessible through a digital form, right? Or is it also working as a print with QR code? Or
I am playing around with a lot of like digital information and QR codes. I've been building archives out of QR codes and seeing how people. I just recently did 2 shows, one in Turkey
Okay.
and one in India with QR codes, and I found it really effective. So I'm also showing the book in work in progress because a lot of this is taking years and years to actually output. The thing is, mobile phones have infiltrated everywhere, and it's a great tool to actually see how one could use them in creative pedagogical way. These books are both analog and digital. It's also like I'm trying to figure out how to publish them because a lot of publishing companies don't want digital books. And so at some point I have to figure out how I want to disseminate this information, whether do I want to make money with books? The books really here on the right is that we're not making any money out of this. So at the end of it is, I mean, but if you give free of cost any service, the society will never respect it also. So how do you honor both aspects of it? Like somebody who's paid something, but it's not in terms of like maybe a euro. I might think of like, I have to figure out how it can be made more accessible. And that's the space that I'm also trying to, I'm just experimenting. Yeah. And these are some of the questions that even I've been asking a lot of publishers and bookmakers.
Vielen Dank. I would like to talk about this one project where you had all this critical data on water, and then you transferred it to a surface, a digital surface, where again, yeah, a score. Yes, it was a score, which I really liked. But I was thinking, how do you think about the sound that is created, and the feelings that this sounds might anticipate? They are very smooth sounds, and they are in comparison to the critical data. Somehow, it's the sounds do not speak about the intensity and the critical context of the data. Yeah.
My thinking is very different. So I've been looking at how people can actually get mesmerized by this space that I'm creating. I want to slow the time down so people have more time to think. And I'm stretching time as people come into my pieces. Thank you. But the sound is very deeply interconnected. Like, for example, if there was like an antibiotic study and how antibiotics are affecting, say, the health of the water, then we found, like, say, old advertisements promoting antibiotics, distorted that and put that in context. There are some places where, you have coral reefs or, say, plastic bottle. So they're direct data sets, but yes, I have not made it super aggressive because you've got to understand data is not an easy thing for people to be embedded. If the sound itself pushed people away, and I have to access a wider audience. When it's a pedagogical tool, I have to think on a lot of layers, what sound will be and how I can use different kinds of sounds to get people involved also. And at the same point, it works as a composition. So part of it was, yes, we did use more towards an ambient sort of landscape, because part of this is also the landscape by itself. But also I wanted to use this, the thing what I've realized is over a period of time when I presented my first electronic sound interaction piece, and it was malfunctioning because I put the speakers inside the bottle. I did not know about surface speakers. I had to open the cork of the bottle, and I had parents coming and lifting their kids up just to hear the sound coming out of the bottle. And so once they heard the sound, they would be like, where is this sound coming from? It aroused curiosity. It aroused a lot of questions about the data and the process of the storytelling. I think it's over a period of 10 years that I've actually come into a more complex system, because it is out of association with the audience. And also part of it is fundamentally I have to figure out how to sustain myself financially, because I do not have the luxury of the grant systems that are available in Europe. Okay, so I have to self-fund these pieces, which is through the process of selling an artwork. Now, when my private collectors buy it, I'm also governed by the fact, like what can actually be in the market, and I don't deny that. But I want to see how I can infiltrate with technology seductively and sound, and get into the spectrums of a larger audience-driven space, because these pieces demand that. It's not trying to be controversial, but sort of ebb like water and enter into everything.
Thank you. I have a question about the same thing, because I also like very much the graphical partiture, and I'm a musician, and perhaps I would like to know if you perhaps thought about giving this graphics to a musician or to an orchestra or to an ensemble that they play.
I'm really happy that my score, actually, there are different people who I collaborate and work with sonically. So the piece where I didn't play, I worked with Kerry, and we built like these beautiful just frequencies, soundscapes out of frequencies. This was a person I met in the Goa Jazz Festival. See, the thing is, I'm working within a very limited budget. I cannot pay everyone. So a lot of people have inputted resources into my practice because they believe in the idea. And sometimes I've also had to negotiate, okay, if I sell a piece, I would then at some point reach back and give you some payment in some form, because I think it needs to be acknowledged. I know these systems are very difficult to work for where I'm coming from, and also there is a high ambition. I mean, technologically, just to build an app is not a cheap process. But the company that I'm actually working is actually being a co-owner with me and working on this pro bono. So for me, it's at some point, it's just not about the sound. I think you need to do it justice by hearing all the 50 sound sets and see where it's coming from. But it's also the people of the community from different spaces coming together for a common vision. So, I mean, I'm navigating through a lot of spaces, but the thing is, my scores can be taken more further, and you can input more sounds. They are not dying out with one construction. They're growing, they go in, and there is a response system, and that is what I seek. Like, please take my score on board and convert it into a sound. And I'm very happy to have, because this system is expansive. It's not a system, I'm a score creator, that's what I do. I use data, I create scores, and I enjoy the aspect of creating a sonic environment. Now, as it floods, and if I do not take into account of the community engagement and the collaborators that I come into account, because literally this collaborator at Osmoscope, he wrote to me, hey Nandita, we met, can I somehow collaborate and work with you? And for me, that first step is the most important step, because this person is willing just to try out something new which is out of his comfort zone. And all I'm just to say is, if you're interested, feel free to get in touch with me, and we will figure something out, because I always have work.